Hi, and welcome. My name is Amalia Haas, and I'm so delighted that you've joined me today to do this learning together in honor of the holiday of Shavuot. I'm going to be looking at the themes of shame and vulnerability as they relate to women in the book of Ruth. I'm inspired by the work of Brené Brown, the renowned shame theorist who has been investigating the themes of shame and vulnerability and bravery with a particular focus on women and leadership. One might think, Brené says, that fear would be a problem for those who are trying to engage in brave leadership. However, based on her research, she finds that daring leaders feel fear on a regular basis. Feeling fear, says Brené, is not a barrier to brave leadership, but rather the true underlying barrier to brave leadership is how we respond to our fear. The true obstacle is our inner armor, our thoughts. And that is what prevents us from the crucial work of what Brené calls rumbling with vulnerability. For leadership only emerges when we give voice to our vulnerability, first and foremost to ourselves. According to Brené, shame is the most powerful master emotion. It is the fear that we are not good enough. Because true belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world, our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. Those words are from Brené herself. Now, how does this bring us to possibly reflect on women in the book of Ruth? Let's take a quick dive into the presence of women in the book of Ruth, most particularly in the personhood of Ruth herself and Naomi, her mother-in-law. Our book opens with a background description of what's happened, a sort of prologue. And the book of Ruth is actually, if you step back, a very balanced book. Many would even say that it is a biblical fairy tale. Naomi and her two daughters-in-law are with the women of Beit Lechem on the way to the land of Israel. Naomi has begun to head back after having lost her husband and her two sons, both of who had married Moabite women, of which Ruth is one. Then, in the second chapter, there is a conversation between Naomi and Ruth. And Ruth appeals to Naomi and says that she will not be turned back. Unlike her sister-in-law, she insists against Naomi's protestations that she is going to go with her to the land of Israel. And more than that, in perhaps one of the most poetic, for me, tear-drawing quotes in the whole of Tanakh, the whole of the Bible, Ruth says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lie, I will lie." And says, "Your God will be my God." She will not allow herself to be separated from Naomi. There are several other conversations between Ruth and Naomi. There is also a conversation that takes place between Ruth and Boaz, who is the owner of a field that Ruth goes to collect grain in, and also, as it turns out, and crucially to our plot, is a relative as well. And then there's more conversation between Naomi and Ruth. Naomi is guiding Ruth, trying to figure out her future now that she is no longer married to Naomi's son-in-law who died. There is, as the book continues, conversation where Naomi directs Ruth to go to find Boaz on the threshing floor. And then ultimately, through Naomi's insight and guidance, Ruth becomes Boaz's husband, and goes from being, we might say, merely a stranger and an immigrant to becoming the mother of the Messiah through the line of David. Quite an extraordinary evolution. And if we back up and we think about Ruth and Naomi in terms of shame and vulnerability, what we realize is that Naomi was the wife of one of the wealthiest people of her town. And she was a wealthy woman of Bethlehem, and when the famine began in Bethlehem, she and her husband chose to leave and to go to Moab. And when she returns not only widowed, but she returns also without her children, who have both died. And according to their names, it would seem that God has killed them. Their names are very strange fairy tale sort of names, Machlon and Kilion. Naomi says en route back to the city of Bethlehem, she says, call me Mara, call me bitterness, for God has embittered me. Because originally her name is Naomi, it's pleasantness. And the pleasantness of her life, the stability of her home, her husband, her sons, have been taken from her. And so it would seem Naomi is expressing either anger or shame, or perhaps both. Perhaps feeling that God has shamed her by taking away all of her familial ties, except for this Ruth. Her other daughter-in-law agreed to leave, but Ruth did not. Now, when we think about shame and vulnerability in regards to Ruth, the story is really quite different. Ruth comes from the infamous nation of Moab. The Moabites have 3 negative stories about them in the early part of the Torah. And the stories, the associations with Moab are in fact so negative that the Torah declares that Moab may not marry into the Jewish people for many generations. Among the infamous things that the Moabites do, there's a story of an attempt to curse the Jewish people. And there's also the cohabitation of Lot, Abraham's nephew, with his daughter after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So the very birth of the nation of Moab comes from an incestuous cohabitation. And therefore, it would seem on a superficial reading that that the possibility of Ruth joining the Jewish people and actually marrying into the Jewish people would be impossible from the outset. However, the rabbis read the prohibition in the Torah because it says Moav, meaning the singular male form of Moabite, and it does not say Moaviyah. It does not say a female Moabite, that therefore a man from the nation of Moab may not enter into the Jewish people, but a woman can. And therefore Ruth is permitted to marry in. That being said, however, there's still tremendous shame to be associated, still tremendous sort of social designation that is negative and associated with being a Moabite. And if you read the book of Ruth, you will notice quite constant with much of what has been happening in our country, that there are many who speak of immigrants in very negative terms. And certainly in the book of Ruth, Ruth continues throughout to be called the Moaviyah. She is the Moabite. That is how she remains being viewed. And part of what is quite exceptional about Boaz is that he sees past that clan association, let's call it. And he says to Ruth, when he tells her to stay in his field and to glean near his harvesters and not to go to other places, and also when he tells the men who are working for him to allow Ruth to continue to glean and not to molest her. He says to Ruth that he admires her because she is a convert, because she chose to come tachat kanfei shechina. She chose of her own free will to come under the shadowing wings of the divine. And not only that, but that he's also heard about all that she's done for Naomi to try to uplift Naomi in the aftermath of her extraordinary loss and grief, and also to try to simply be mefarnes, to keep Naomi alive by harvesting grain, by collecting, by protecting her as Naomi is in her older years. Boaz sees past the surface of this woman who is obviously a stranger, and he sees her spiritual greatness. And what Ruth says in response to that is essentially, what have I done to deserve your kind regard? Now, obviously, Ruth's vulnerability is not the same vulnerability that Brene Brown is speaking about when Brene talks about emotional vulnerability. Because the kind of vulnerability that Boaz is aware of, and that Ruth and Naomi must surely be aware of also, is the true vulnerability of being at the bottom of society, of being a stranger, of having none to few social connections. And that is Ruth's situation. Nonetheless, I think it's important and worthwhile to look at Ruth's responses and notice that although she is moved deeply by Boaz taking note of her and says so, she does not speak in a shaming way of herself. In other words, she seems to carry within her a very strong sense of dignity, of the dignity of having chosen to become a Jew, of the dignity of caring for her mother-in-law, the dignity of being in the land of Israel and connected to the home where her former husband grew up. Now, part of how the Bible and the book of Ruth communicate their deeper messages is through turns of language. And one of those is parallelism. There are, generally speaking, 3 different kinds of parallelism. And it really is crucial to biblical writing and gives it a lot of its poetic quality. There's synonymous parallelism, where a second clause repeats and reinforces the idea that it's expressed in the first clause. There's contrasting parallelism, where the second clause presents a contrast to an idea expressed in the first. And then there's complementary parallelism, where the second clause continues and expands the idea expressed in the first clause. Now, the book of Ruth actually contains examples of each kind of parallelism. Boaz uses the synonymous parallelism when he asks Ruth not to go to a different field and invites her to eat with his men in his field. He says, "Do not go glean in another field, nor go away from here. And eat of the bread, and dip your morsel in the vinegar." We also find a synonymous longer parallelism when Boaz says of Ruth to his workers. He says, "Let her even glean among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And let fall also some of the handfuls on purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." And then Naomi uses contrasting parallelism to describe her situation on returning to Beit Lechem. She says, "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me back empty." Okay? Is she feeling shame? Quite possibly. So here she's contrasting fullness and emptiness. Fullness in Beit Lechem and emptiness in Moab. So part of what this makes me wonder about is parallelism between Ruth and Naomi. They have so many differences between them. Naomi, having been a mother already, says to her daughter-in-laws, "Even if I were to be able to provide sons for you, would you tarry for them until they are grown? Would you for them refrain from having husbands?" And of course, one daughter-in-law goes back, but Ruth follows her. Now, when we look also further into Ruth around the question of shame, vulnerability, and I might add dignity, part of what's interesting to look at is stories where Ruth is, the text is drawing a parallel to other parts of the Bible. So one of the places where this happens is when Ruth is in a field And what happens to her is similar to what happens to Abraham's servant by the well. So this is Abraham's servant speaking. He says, Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray you, send me good speed this day. Show kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, I stand here by a well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out and draw water. And let it come to pass that the girl to whom I shall say, let down your pitcher, I pray you, that I may drink, she shall say, drink. Okay? And then if you notice that there's a parallel to what happens to Ruth. And here's the text. It says, and she happened to come to a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Beit Lechem. And then Boaz said to his servant that was set over the reapers, whose maiden is this? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. So there's a parallel that's being drawn between Abraham, who is known for the personality trait of loving kindness, and Ruth. Similarly, these stories also emphasize a connection to the house of the mother. It says in Genesis, and the girl ran and told them of her mother's house. And in the book of Ruth, it says, go, return each of you to her mother's house. In both stories, there's a stress being placed on the departure from the parents' home. In Genesis, it says, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth? And in Ruth, it says, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth. Okay? And then finally, there's a parallel that's being drawn here, Abraham to Rebekah and Ruth. And so Rebekah, when she sees Isaac, it says, and when she saw Isaac, she descended from the camel. Some say she fell. In the book of Ruth, it says, then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground. So these parallels go on and on. In Genesis, it says, whose daughter are you? And in Ruth, it says, whose maiden is this? And in the Hebrew, these parallels are very tactile in the language. The stories continue to be drawn together even as we get closer and closer to Boaz and Ruth getting married. The subject of in the Abraham story, his servant says, I will not eat until I have finished my errand. And in the book of Ruth, Naomi says to Ruth, the man will not rest until he finishes this errand today, the matter today. So the Bible is building this parallel between the greatness of character of Abraham and of Rebekah on the one hand, and the greatness of character, and mind you, Abraham and Rebekah being, Abraham is the father of the Jewish people, and not only biologically, but also spiritually. And then Rebekah continuing that line of chesed, of loving kindness. On the one hand, these are the first Jews, the first people of Israel. And on the other hand, this woman who would be expected to be scorned as not just a stranger, but a Moabite. She then taking this unexpected sort of role of leadership through her spiritual inheritance of that very line of Abraham and Rebekah. And just in case there's any doubt that she is the spiritual inheritor, the book of Ruth says very clearly at the end that it is Ruth's son who who is, again, in a very fairy tale-like mode, who the book actually says Naomi takes this child to her breast and nurses the baby. It says a baby has been born to Naomi. This is actually Ruth's baby. But the point being that the Messiah of David actually descends from a nation that was certainly, on one read, prohibited to marry into the Jewish people. What can we take from all of this in terms of women and shame? Well, certainly the fact that the rabbis themselves find a textual means of saying that this marriage was prohibited of Ruth and Boaz, and the fact that Naomi is proactively setting up that relationship to happen, and that Ruth is the one for whom the book itself is named. Clearly, the Torah wants us to view Ruth as a role model and to view her as an embodiment of our values. She makes herself extraordinarily vulnerable, again, not only emotionally by insisting to Naomi that she's going to follow her when Naomi is trying to turn her back, but also by giving up what is familiar, her home, her family of origin, the mores that she knew, in order to go as quite possibly an unwelcome stranger and forever a stranger, one who will never completely fit in, to join the Jewish people. She makes this tremendous sacrifice, but to her, this is the only choice to make because it is the one that her heart is calling for. And because she has such deep conviction, she doesn't experience shame, despite the fact that the text repeatedly and the people of Moab, the women bystanders who are referred to, always referred to her as Moabiyah, the Moabite woman. She is never allowed to move out of that designation. But nonetheless, she doesn't wear shame from that, because inside of her, she has the conviction that no, she chose this path. She loves Naomi, her mother-in-law. She loves the culture, the true depth of culture that she has experienced and seen in Judaism, and she loves God. She feels called to this path. And so in thinking about the receiving of the Torah on Shavuot, part of what I see this book telling us is that we are called to go into the places of our vulnerability, particularly in our deepest relationships, to have the bravery that although we may encounter shame, we will hold on to the convictions of our heritage, and God willing, that we too, like Ruth, will have the merit to raise up great names in Israel, to create leaders and teachers and learners of Torah, whether those are our biological children or not, whether they are the people that we touch, the people who we inspire and who we support, as Ruth did for Naomi. May we be deeply inspired by her model and by the teachings of this book that is held at the center of Shavuot. I want to thank you all so much for joining me for this learning today, and I would welcome any comments and thoughts on this topic of vulnerability, shame, and bravery related to women on Shavuot, and Chag Sameach.